Focus of the presentation, focusing on murder and how it distinguishes itself from manslaughter, who the defendant is, who the victims are, what the case was about, how were the elements of the charges established, legal and sentencing aspects, issues and implications of the case. Who is the defendant? Greg Lynn is a former Australian commercial airline pilot who gained national infamy following his conviction for the murder of camper Carol Clay. Born in 1966, Lynn had a long career in aviation, working for several airlines, including Ansett and Jetstar. He was known to colleagues as technically proficient, but somewhat reclusive and intense. Outside of work, Lynn was an avid camper and hunter who frequently traveled to the remote areas of Victoria's high country. Who are the victims? Carol Clay and Russell Hill were two elderly Australians whose tragic deaths captured national attention in Australia. Carol Clay, 73, was a former president of the Country Women's Association and a much-loved community figure known for her warmth and generosity. Russell Hill, 74, was a retired logger and radio enthusiast. The pair had a long-standing friendship that reportedly developed into a secret romantic relationship later in life, despite Hill being married. In March 2020, Clay and Hill went camping together in the remote Woonongatta Valley in Victoria's Alpine National Park. They were last heard from on March 20th when Hill made a call via his HF radio. Their burnt-out campsite was found days later with personal belongings left behind, but the couple had vanished. The mysterious circumstances prompted a lengthy investigations that led to the arrest and trial of former Jetstar pilot Greg Lynn in 2021. What is the case about? In March 2020, Carol Clay and Russell Hill disappeared while camping in the Woonongatta Valley, a secluded region in Victoria's Alpine National Park. Their campsite was later discovered burnt, with personal belongings left behind, but no trace of the couple. The mysterious circumstances of their disappearance prompted an extensive investigation by Victoria Police. The investigation into the disappearance of Clay and Hill spanned over a year, involving covert surveillance and forensic analysis. Police identified Greg Lynn as a person of interest after tracking his movements and installing listening devices in his vehicle and home. These recordings captured Lynn making incriminating statements about the missing campers. In November 2021, Lynn was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. How were the elements of the charges established? Lynn's trial commenced in June 2024 at the Victorian Supreme Court. He pleaded not guilty to both charges, but admitted to disposing of the bodies and attempting to cover up the deaths. Lynn claimed that the deaths were accidental, resulting from a confrontation over a joan, during which Clay was fatally shot and Hill was killed in a subsequent struggle with his knife. The prosecution argued that Lynn acted with intent to kill and took deliberate steps to destroy evidence. After a 5-week trial, the jury found Lynn guilty of murdering Carol Clay, but acquitted him of murdering Russell Hill. In October 2024, Justice Michael Croucher sentenced Greg Lynn to 32 years in prison with a non-parole period of 24 years. The judge described the murder as a violent, brutal, horrific death and acknowledged the profound grief of Clay's family. Lynn has since lodged an appeal against his conviction and sentence, maintaining his innocence and claiming that both deaths were accidental. The appeal process is ongoing. The case has had a significant emotional impact on the families of both victims and has been widely covered in the media. The trial's revelations, including Lynn's recorded statements and the details of his actions following the deaths, have sparked public outrage and debate over the justice system's handling of the case. Greg Lynn's conviction has left a lasting impression on the Australian public, highlighting the complexities of criminal investigations and the devastating consequences of violence.
In October 2024, Greg Lynn was found guilty of the murder of 73-year-old Carol Clay. The jury found Lynn guilty after a 5-week trial where he was then sentenced to 32 years in prison with a minimum of 24 years. Lynn is eligible for parole in 2045. He was also found not guilty of murdering Clay's fellow camper Russell Hill. This case is extremely well known, especially in Australia, due to the high-profile nature and the brutal circumstances surrounding the deaths. The case gathered attention from the media as well as public interest. This is because news outlets would regularly report, such as ABC, leading to more public interest and attention from the media. Lynn's case, as of yet, has not led to any policy changes besides the immediate actions that were taken by law enforcement and the legal system to investigate and prosecute the case. The trial did raise public awareness about the importance of having proper investigations and also about delays in the criminal justice system. Initially, a judge did decide that some of Lynn's statements made could not be used as evidence. This is because there were certain methods used by officers during a 4-day interview. The judge discovered that the police officers had used certain strategies described as oppressive and improper. This led to some of the evidence of that interview being excluded from the trial. The prosecution focused on Lynn's actions after the murder. These involve tampering with the crime scene, burning the bodies, and attempting to conceal evidence. These actions did raise suspicion, but the prosecution faced difficulty in proving circumstances of the deaths due to the limited evidence and Lynn's explanation that the deaths were accidental. Lynn has recently lodged an appeal against his conviction and sentence, which is currently pending before the Court of Appeal. While the appellate process is ongoing, the legal principles and findings from this case are likely not to be referenced in other court decisions. Lynn's defense team did argue that Lynn's actions after the murders were due to panic and he was trying to protect himself. Lynn's case acknowledged that the lack of evidence that was available to the prosecution, which included the lack of witnesses, forensic evidence, and a clear motive. The prosecution did struggle to prove how the couple died and the order of the murders that occurred.
One of the key issues that was a part of the Glen Lynn case was murder versus manslaughter. So to define the difference between the two, murder occurs when someone unlawfully kills another with the act and the intent to kill or cause serious harm, whereas manslaughter involves causing death, but typically without the same intent, and it can be divided into two categories, which is voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. So voluntary manslaughter is unique and it occurs when the act and the intent of murder are both present, but the law recognises that an additional factor which reduces moral blame. So in contrast, involuntary manslaughter involves killing without the intent to kill, or cause serious harm, usually which is due to recklessness or criminal negligence. Voluntary manslaughter isn't a separate charge that a prosecutor can bring. It's partial defence to a murder charge, and that means that the defendant is charged with murder and they can argue that their responsibility should be reduced to a provocation or a mental condition. And if the court accepts that, then the charge is reduced to manslaughter and the sentencing is no longer mandatory life imprisonment. This only applies if both murder elements are accepted and if the defendant denies intent or responsibility entirely, which is what we saw in the case of Glen Lynn, then manslaughter may not legally apply. So in that case, the defence argued that the deaths were entirely accidental, while prosecution insisted that they were intentional murders. Since neither side presented manslaughter as a valid explanation, the judge ruled that the jury were not able to find them guilty of manslaughter. In the Greg Lynn case, the jury had to decide either murder or acquittal. So Lynn admitted to causing the deaths and destroying the evidence, and the prosecution said that he acted with intent and the cover-up was the cover-up supported that, and the defence claimed that the deaths were tragic accidents which weren't murder or manslaughter. So the manslaughter option was removed because it didn't align with either side's version of events, and that shows how the availability of manslaughter depends on the legal narrative and not just the facts. So in the end, Lynn was convicted of murdering Carol Clay but acquitted of murdering Russell Hill, demonstrating how intent, evidence and legal framing all play critical roles in determining guilt. And another key issue was Lynn was a witness in his own case. So why was testifying a risky move? So Greg Lynn chose to testify in his own defence, which made him the main focus of the case. So defence lawyers often debate whether or not their client should speak in court. On one hand, it can make the accused seem more human and help to explain parts of the story that aren't very clear. But on the other hand, it also gives the prosecution a chance to cross-examine the person. That can be dangerous. When an accused testifies, the jury might start judging whether they believe the story instead of asking if the prosecution proved its case beyond reasonable doubt. So sometimes staying silent can actually help more than speaking, especially if the accused story doesn't sound right or clashes with other evidence. Lynn told his side of the story in a calm and detailed way, which may have helped him in the case of Russell Hill, where the jury found him not guilty of murder. In his explanation, he also included how he tried to hide what happened, which made some jurors suspicious of his motives. During cross-examination, the prosecution pointed out inconsistencies in his story and suggested he was more focused on protecting himself rather than telling the truth. So in the end, the jury had to decide if they found Lynn's story believable or if it seemed like he was just trying to save himself. His testimony likely helped him in one part of the case, but may have hurt him in the other. Choosing whether a defendant should testify is one of the hardest decisions that a defence lawyer should make, and there's no rule, and it has several things that it may depend on, whether or not the testimony was needed to explain what happened, if the accused can handle being questioned under pressure, and a lot of other factors. A lot of experienced lawyers prefer to keep the client off the stand, especially if the prosecution's case is weak, which will, letting the accused speak can create more risk than rewards. If the prosecution has strong evidence, then keeping quiet might seem suspicious or not good enough. And in Lynn's case, testifying was probably the only way to explain how the deaths occurred. But by doing that, he gave prosecution a chance to attack his story. And it shows how difficult and important this decision can be, which is made by defence lawyers.